Ethnography of the Otomi. Episode 3. Across the plaza were a set of murals related to the history of the town, rendered in that two-dimensional style so favored by most modern Mexican muralists. Panels displayed scenes of Otomi dressed alike in white, living under the rule of Spain. One panel portrayed coiffured Spanish women in condescending camaraderie with their Otomi slaves, while in another panel Spanish soldiers struck them down with swords as they begged for mercy. Written, photographed, and podcast video produced by Jack Lamb. Dr. Terry Stocker and Jack Lamb. Photograph taken in 1981 as we ascended the 18,500 feet volcano, Pico de Orizaba, to explore, survey, and photograph the lost Aztec mines. On a gloomy day threatening rain, we continued to investigate the Otomi culture in the pueblo of Acambe, a town about 40 miles west of Tula. Acambe dates back to the first Otomi settlement of the region in roughly the 9th century. Based on recent archaeological discoveries, the early community was a significant cultural center even before the rise of the Toltecs. Stocker explained as we drove to the Acambe Plaza. Unfortunately, with the only viable economy in the region being subsistence farming, the majority of the Otomi living here today are impoverished. In the nearby mercado, farmers displayed their produce on plastic tarps spread across the pavement. The varieties of vegetables included green chilies, tomatoes, limons, onions, garlic, potatoes, avocado, and corn in various pre-sized smaller mounds, presumably grouped for each sale by quantity, since scales were never in use. A little girl no more than 7 years old, dressed in a white and pink frock with a ruffled collar almost hidden under a huge green sweater, looked much too young to be a merchant. Yet she sold vegetables to her customers with the same degree of competency as the adult vendors. Most of the women in the market dressed in rough-made dark-colored dresses and skirts reaching to their ankles. Some wore shawls or serapes draping their shoulders and cowling their heads, while others wore cowboy-style or flat-brimmed straw hats. Disturbingly, no matter her age, most of the women appeared worn and hardened by the weighty demands placed upon her by life, diet, and culture, stripping her of her beauty by the time she birthed her second child. We clearly entered the mercado at the end reserved for the poorest of farmers, because further down the aisle we saw vendors with their wares spread out across tables under canopies to protect them from the rain. "Hey! There's a pulqueria," Stocker said, beaming happily, as he pointed to a large pavilion open on 4 sides beneath a gabled roof of corrugated metal. Inside, men dressed in long-sleeved shirts and straw hats enthusiastically drank pulque from brightly painted wooden bowls and half-gourds called jicara and zoma. At 1 peso, or about 4 cents a gourd, midday drinkers could afford to guzzle pulque until they passed out drunk, if that was their intent. Raucously joking and laughing, the men certainly enjoyed drinking the fermented juice of the maguey and demanded refills from the assembly of women busily ladling the frothy alcoholic beverage from enormous plastic buckets. Stocker immediately went over to the servers, and since Barb detested the taste of the alcoholic beverage, bought only 2 gourds of pulque. While I was not fond of it either, this pulque tasted much less acerbic. That said, I doubted I would ever drink the fermented cactus juice by choice. Stocker, however, did not share my opinion on the flavor of pulque, and he summarily guzzled down his gourd without taking a breath. And then immediately went back to get a refill of the fermented agave juice. "Come on, dude, let's go talk to those guys over there and see what we can learn," he shouted above the noise, eagerly taking hold of my elbow to pull me along while all but ignoring Barbara, who trailed after us. Stocker began talking loudly to the 2 middle-aged Otomi men and swiftly bought them a round of pulque. Despite feeling the effects of the alcoholic beverage, he shrewdly took note when each man tipped his refilled gourd to spill a few droplets of the frothy liquid onto the floor before deigning to take a drink. "Oi, ¿por qué tiras el pulque en el piso antes de tomarlo?" he quizzed the men. "Hey, why do you spill pulque on the floor before you take a drink?" "Es tradición ofrecer pulque a dos conejo antes de tomar," one of the men replied. "It is a tradition to offer 2 rabbit pulque before drinking." "¿Quién es dos conejo?" Stocker pressed who is 2 rabbit, when he did not grasp the reference. "Dos conejo es omatocli, quien pide que ese sacrifican dos gotas antes de que la jicra toque mis labios. The Otomi explained insouciantly, "Tu rabbit is Omatokli who demands 2 drops to be sacrificed before a full gourd can touch my lips." "Quieres decker Omatokli el dios Azteca?" Stalker said aghast. "Do you mean Omatokli the Aztec god?" "No sé sobre eso. Omatokli es un dios de nuestros antepasados, no sabía que él también era una deidad azteca." The man answered with an unknowing shrug, "I do not know about that. Omatokli is a god of our ancestors, I did not know he was also an Aztec deity." "Why the hell are Otomi offering sacrifices to an Aztec god?" he yelled at Barbara and I in amazement. "We never would have learned this if we didn't take the time to drink pulque with these guys." Stalker considered this bit of information learned by chance a major discovery. It rocked his professional world that an ancient religious tradition managed to persist unchanged 500 years after the Christian god replaced the Aztec gods in Mesoamerica. "So why hasn't anyone learned this before now?" I shouted above the raucous noise of the drunkards in the pavilion. It's not like it was being kept a secret. Archaeologists don't come into a pulcheria to get stinking drunk with the descendants of the cultures they excavate and study. Stalker shouted back. They don't know this shit because they're never in the right place to ask the right questions. I barely finished my second gourd of pulque and refused to drink a third when Stalker pressed me. I had never seen him this drunk before, guzzling one zoma after another of pulque as he flittered around the room slurring his words in Spanish and in English, bizarrely trying to interact with the Otomi borrachos in the pavilion. I found Barbara standing under the pavilion eaves silently watching the rain fall over the mercado. And eventually, presumably tiring of drinking pulque with his Otomi friends, Stalker decided to rejoin us. "I'm glad I found you both," he slurred. "You won't believe what I learned in the pulqueria." Just as I was about to respond, he interrupted me. "There's no time to talk right now. We need to get to a house where pulque is made and sold. One of my drinking buddies told me how to get there." So when we returned to the Blue Goose, he directed me to take the road south and drive until he told me to turn. 2 miles later, he cautioned me to start slowing down. "Okay, now drive up to that big house on the left," he ordered before stating in awe. "Whoever lives in that big house is richer than all the other Otomi here combined." I drove up the dirt road to a large 3-story house out of place in the treeless terrain. As we walked up to the front door, we caught up to a little man, also on his way to the house. Oddly, he held an earthen pitcher in his hands. "Buenas tardes." Stalker greeted him, and then asked him his name. "Como es el llama?" "Francisco." "Pase usted primero por favor." The man replied, "Please, you go first." "Gracias, amigo," Stalker said, stepping up to knock loudly and vigorously on the wooden entry. When the door finally opened, an Otomi woman in her 30s glared out at us suspiciously. "Sí? ¿Por qué está aquí?" she asked warily. "Yes? Why are you here?" "Escuch que aquí hacen pulque." "Es cierto?" Stalker slurred without greeting. "I heard you make pulque here." "Is that true?" "Sí, ¿por qué?" The woman replied, "Yes, why?" Barbara explained our interest in pulque, and asked if she would answer a few questions about her business. She also mentioned that someone in the mercado sent us here. Then as we filed past her into the house, Francisco spoke to the woman in Otomi, and she offhandedly waved him inside as well. The woman led us into a room bereft of furniture, the only item being a dirty white plastic container against the wall, the metric equivalent of a 5-gallon bucket with a scummy ladle hanging from the rim. Barbara began to question her about her business, but it was soon obvious she knew nothing about making pulque. "Terry, are you sure this is the right house?" Barbara probed. She knows less about pulque than I do. Yeah, that's what I gathered listening to her. While Barbara took a moment to compose herself, the man named Francisco stepped forward and spoke to the lady in Otomi. What he asked became apparent when she began to ladle pulque from the dirty bucket into the large pitcher he clutched between his hands. Then as soon as it was full, he dropped 2 pesos into her palm. Quick! Shoot a photograph of this guy buying pulque from the rich lady, Stalker declared excitedly. After I told him I finished, Barbara thanked the woman and Francisco with a courteous smile. Thank you both for your patience. Gracias a los dos por su paciencia. The little man nodded in acknowledgement and in farewell, and without another word, he turned and headed towards the door with his pitcher of pulque. 30 minutes ago, I knew Stalker was drunk. Yet now he leapt into action like a runner hearing a starting gun. Briskly thanking the woman with a brief gracias, he rushed after Francisco. Unsure why he left, Barb and I scurried after him, catching up just as they reached the van. Francisco, ¿qué que lo lev? Lo levaremos a donde usted quiera ir. Stalker asked the little man eagerly. Francisco, do you want a ride? We'll take you anywhere you want to go. See. He replied since he carried a large and rather heavy full pitcher of pulque. After Stalker introduced us, he began interrogating Francisco, and soon knew he lived a few kilometers down the road in the pueblo of San Pedro de los Mejates, where he worked as a stonecutter sculpting mejates. Es verdad? Stalker exclaimed, is that true, then added in English. Damn. This is our lucky day. I didn't understand. What's a mejate? I asked. Mesoamerican women have used mejates to grind maize into the cornmeal they need to make tortillas for thousands of years, he said excitedly. There aren't that many mejate makers left in Mexico anymore, so it's amazingly lucky we ran into Francisco here. It took only a few minutes to get to his house, where we promptly met Lupita, his wife, and their 3 young children. She wore a hat similar to Francisco's, except the brim was wider and she held it in place with a cord tied under her chin. Like her husband, she was short of stature. While Barbara talked to Lupita and Stalker to Francisco, I studied their homestead. Maguey and nopales cactus planted tightly together fenced the puddled and muddy yard, with stacked rocks filling in the gaps between each plant. The enclosure encompassed the yard and a small house built low to the ground, as well as a couple of pens containing a dozen chickens and a single turkey. Along one side of the cactus hedge, recently washed clothes draped Maguey's stripped of thorns so they could dry in the mist-laden air. Considering the overcast sky, I could not imagine the clothes would dry anytime soon. Come see this. Stalker called to me from across the yard. Francisco is going to show us his workshop. I walked over to the front corner of the fenced-in yard where several rectangular slabs of stone leaned up against the piled rocks. 2 more rectangular slabs, sculpted to some degree to look very much like ancient artifacts, lay in the mud nearby. Stalker was quizzing Francisco as I approached, so it took him a minute before he could tell me what they were discussing. Francisco chisels his mejates out of quarried basalt slabs, Stalker said, bending to pick up one of the heavy rectangular blocks. Basalt is the porous volcanic stone used for thousands of years to make mejates in Mexico. How does he saw the blanks so perfectly? I asked, impressed by the rectilinear corners and the smooth and even faces of the flawlessly shaped slabs of basalt. ¿Cómo lo corta tan perfectamente? Stalker passed on my question to the stonemason. Otros hombres extraen el alto de la tierra y lo cortan en losas. Después, cargan las losas en burros y los enregan a los taladores de piedras, como me quien hace mejates. Francisco answered tonelessly. He says other men quarry the basalt from the ground and saw it into slabs. Stalker translated for me. Then they load the slabs on burros and deliver them to all the stone carvers like Francisco who make mejates. Are those mejates? I asked, indicating the slabs. They will be when he's done, he replied cursorily. How long does it take him to make one? I queried, assuming it would take time to sculpt the basalt. Again Stalker asked him my question. ¿Cuánto tiempo tarda en hacer un mejate? 2 días, más o menos. Francisco replied, which this time I understood. Incredible. What tools does he use? I asked with interest, as hand tools had fascinated me since I built my handmade home at Singing Stones. I'll ask, Stalker said and addressed the little man. ¿Qué tipo de herramientas utiliza para trabajar el basalto? He asked Francisco, what kind of tools do you use to work the basalt? Tengo un martillo, un cincel y una escuadra. Francisco replied while pulling back a small piece of canvas protecting his tools from the rain, revealing a hammer with a double-sided head, a worn chisel, and a carpenter's framing square. Muestrinos como trabaja el basalto. Stalker said to the stone carver, show us how you work the basalt. Bending over a partially worked basalt block, he then chipped away fragments with the hammer and the chisel before uncurling his back to stand upright again. He needs new tools, Stalker said in dismay. Francisco doesn't need tools as much as he needs a workbench. I marveled, pondering how he managed to work standing bent over the basalt for hours each day. That's got to be literally backbreaking work. You're telling me? He makes less than $10 US for each metate he makes. Stalker granted. Francisco next showed us a nearly finished metate lying off to one side. The top surface of the basalt curved to form a depression, which Stalker said would keep the corn kernels in place when grinding. Rummaging through the basalt slabs scattered on the ground, Francisco picked up a mano and held it atop the metate to show us how it should fit. The rounded mano, slightly tapered at both ends and shorter than the width of the surface of the metate, looked like a rolling pin without handles. Because the mano mated to the curve of the metate, the maize ground evenly across its surface. Come on, Stalker said, taking my arm to pull me along. I heard Lupita tell Barbara she needs to feed her kids, so we've been invited into their home. The house was about 15 by 10 feet, so small, it seemed incredible the family could live in such close quarters. Except for a slanted roof made of half-pipe red clay tiles, the construction was exceedingly primitive. 3 of the walls had been made of shaped stone blocks stacked in rows without mortar, while the 4th wall was built of stacked field rocks. The mist began to thicken as we stooped low to pass through a door covering made out of a scrap of canvas. While Francisco and his family had no trouble standing upright beneath the low ceiling, we gringos had to hunch over to keep from bumping our heads. The dirt floor inside the windowless chamber smelled of dampness and dust, even though it seemed almost, but not quite, wet enough to stick to my boot soles. If not for the flames of the small cooking fire, it would have been too dark to see anything in the windowless, unlit chamber given the gloom of the overcast and mist-laden sky. A cook fire burned within a circle of stones in the kitchen half of the house, adjacent to a wall made of ill-fitting field rocks. The gaps between the stones allowed only dim light to enter, and some, but not nearly enough of the smoke to escape the squat enclosure. Unfortunately, the smoke hovered near the ceiling, making it difficult for us to breathe while we stood. So it made sense for us to kneel alongside Francisco and his family on the woven mats placed around the fire pit. ¿De qué está hecho esto? Barbara asked, what is this made of, after she knelt down on the woven mat and rubbed its coarse texture between her thumb and finger to try to identify the material. De Isli, la fibra de los hojas de maguey. The Otomi said of Isli, the fiber of the maguey leaves. En serios? El Otomi on tige utensilios domesticos con fibra de Isli? Stalker asked eagerly. Really? Do the Otomi still weave household goods with Isli fiber? La mayoría de los utensilios domésticos que se venden en el mercado están hechos de Isli. Francisco replied, most household items sold in the mercado are made of Isli. I can't imagine how we missed that. Stalker said to us, perplexed. Next time we're in a mercado, we need to look more closely at the household goods. We studied the room and its bare furnishings by the light of the meager flames emanating from the cooking fire, while Francisco and his family sat silently waiting. Their house is so tiny, Barbara said as she peered into the dark recesses. Where do you think they sleep? Why don't you ask? Her husband suggested. Donde dormir? She asked our hosts. Francisco stood and took 2 steps into the darkness at the back of the small room, then returned holding an Isli sleeping mat rolled up with a thin wool blanket. Desenrolaremos estos pidetes cerca del fuego que es donde está más caliente. He explained impassively. We unroll these mats near the fire where it is warmer, while half unrolling the mat and placing it on the floor to show us exactly how it was done each night. Lupita sat on her heels next to the fire ring and began preparing the meal we assumed was for her children. Clay pots containing consumable ingredients lay on the floor within reach, while to her left against the wall wooden shelves acted as a larder holding a few jars and 2 small baskets. As we watched, she lifted the lid from a much larger basket to reveal stacked tortillas. Terry turned to our host and asked, "Francisco, ¿dónde está su jarro? Vamos a tomar pulque." "Francisco, where's your pitcher? Let's drink pulque." "Sí." The little man responded, smiling for the first time, with even a glint of eager anticipation in his eyes. Then turning to Barbara and me, he asked if we wanted a drink too. "Ustedes también quieren pulque?" "No gracias." I replied quickly, "No thanks." "Para mí tampoco, gracias." Barbara answered politely with disguised disgust, "None for me either, thanks." "Mujer. Trim dos tazas." The Otomi ordered his wife sternly. "Woman. Bring me 2 cups." Francisco lifted the pitcher and poured the frothy liquid into 1 cup and handed it to Stalker, then filled the second cup for himself. Clearly, he waited for his guest to drink first, so Stalker took a swig and struggled not to make a face at the acerbically sour taste. Without being nearly as fastidious, the little man swiftly guzzled down his glass of pulque and reached for the pitcher to refill it, while asking Stalker if he wanted more as well. "¿Quieres más?" "Damn. This is really rank shit." Stalker choked out. Instead of throwing it away, the lady in the big house must dump her 3-day-old swill on Francisco because she knows he can't afford any better. Despite his low opinion of the quality of the pulque, he managed to gulp down what remained in his cup, and then held it out for Francisco to refill. Francisco's wife added wood to the fire when we first entered the house and placed a comal on the coals to heat. A comal is a clay disc about 18 inches in diameter used as a griddle or hot plate to grill or warm food. Then she began to mix the contents of the 4 clay pots together in a small basalt bowl she set before her called a molcajete. For the second time that day, Stalker got drunk, and at first, he refused our repeated attempts to get him to leave. Luckily, before the pitcher was empty, he began to get sleepy and abruptly decided on his own we had to leave so he could take a nap. "I've got to lie down or I'm going to fall over into the cooking fire," he admitted as he stood up unsteadily. Offering our thanks to our hosts for their hospitality, we made our way to the van with Francisco and family in tow. Once there, Barbara looked through the trade duffels and found children's clothing to give to Lupita. I wanted to do something to help this Otomi family, but I did not want to insult Francisco by simply giving him a handout in pesos. I would have bought a methate had he one to sell me, but alas he did not. However, I realized he might have a molcajete I could buy instead. "¿Tien algún molcajete que pueda comprar?" I asked Francisco, "Do you have a molcajete I can buy?" I felt relieved when he nodded affirmatively and ran off to fetch one. When he returned, I handed him 400 pesos, more than twice what he normally received. It felt good to give him money, and I felt pleased to have the molcajete and mano as a testimony to being here. But I hoped he would use the money to buy food to feed his family, and not squander it on a binge imbibing pulque. The conversation continued after I sat behind the wheel, ready to leave if only Barbara would climb aboard the van. Peculiarly, now that we were leaving, Francisco and his family found their silent tongues, and talked to Barbara. But with Stalker already fast asleep on the bed, I knew we would not get away unless I took action. "Vamonos!" I suddenly proclaimed, "Let's go." And pushing in the clutch, I started and gunned the engine. Taking my cue, Barbara jumped into the front seat and everyone exchanged brief final farewells. Then without waiting, I let out the brake and coasted down the trail towards the road in view a quarter-mile ahead. Glancing into the rearview mirror, as anticipated, I saw all 6 of them waving to us as we drove away. Look for the next podcast episode of Ethnography of the Otomi. Episode 4.